In the southwestern part of the United States, in the late 1800s, lived a special breed of men known as the Gunfighters. Introducing Kenny Canada as Bill Longer, Rowan Ellsworth as Ben Thompson,
no respect for the law, victims never saw
Danny Boyd as Luke Short, and Kenny Canada as John King Fisher.
Gunfighter.
Ben Thompson, born in 1843 at Lockhart, Texas. He led an uneventful childhood and became a printer in his late teens. In his early 20s, life looked pretty dull to Ben, with not much to look forward to outside of a wife and kids and maybe printing a risque book or two. With his thirst for gambling and heavy reliance on his hunches, he soon became restless. Because he and his brother Bill were constantly practicing with their weapons behind the barn, Ben had no qualms about taking to the trail. And one day he just up and left Lockhart. Forever. Any man who rode the trail had to be constantly on his guard. Snakes, scorpions, and insects were just the normal hazards encountered. The most dangerous and the ones to be really feared were the bad men who'd spit on your dead body after they'd stripped it clean. If you had gold fillings, they'd rip out the teeth and melt the gold out later. These weren't men, they were parasites who lived to prey on others. It isn't recorded whether Ben Thompson ever ran afoul of any of these scavenger killers, but if he did, we have to assume that they didn't get a chance to relate any tales about the gunfighter with the top hat and the cane. Oh yes, he picked up a cane in his travels too and put it to deadly use many times. New Orleans, where a man could make a fortune if he played his cards right. Two happenings changed the course of Ben's life here. He took a fancy to a rich man's top hat, and he killed his first man over a woman. Poker was Ben's favorite game, and his deadpan expression never let his opponents in a card game or in a duel warn them what his intentions were. It paid off for him in many ways. In this particular game, the affluent gambler Ben was playing with ran out of cash and started to write an IOU. Ben had been admiring the man's hat as the game progressed, and he told him that he would accept it in place of his IOU. The gambler thought Ben was joking at first, but at Ben's insistence, placed his hat on the pile of money. After all, he would be putting it back on his own head in short order. He had the winning hand, didn't he? After the other gamblers passed, the man showed his full house and eagerly reached for the big pot. His gloating was short-lived, however, as Ben exposed his own hand, 4 sixes. Ben won the hat, and it became a trademark throughout his life as a gunfighter. Of necessity, men of his ilk shied away from romantic entanglements, picking up their women whenever the opportunity arose. They rarely married, wives and kids being a yoke around their necks, curtailing their adventuresome spirits. Killing his first man was almost an effortless beginning to a career that ended the lives of over 40 men. Ben Thompson played life like a game of poker, calling each shot with a precision and calmness that awed the many witnesses to his killings. He played the gentleman at all times, always letting his opponents make the first move. Unlike his brother Bill, Ben had no thirst for killing, but didn't shy away from it when the situation warranted it. Among the many great gunfighters, Bat Masterson was quoted as saying that he thought that Ben Thompson was the most accurate, fastest gunslinger in the West. Ben stayed in New Orleans, becoming a familiar figure around the big saloons, gambling and wenching. But his thoughts soon turned to the Civil War, which was raging nearby. He heard that Colonel Baylor's Confederate regiment was camped near Austin and left to join up. Baylor, realizing it would be nearly impossible to recruit a regiment in the West, got his men by setting up the biggest buffalo hunt ever attempted. Calling for 1,000 men to join him and bring their own weapons, Baylor finally whipped them into a fighting force to be reckoned with. Maybe it was only a ragtag army with no uniforms supplied, but they wound up establishing the Arizona Territory for the Confederate cause. Ben got along well with most of the men who were from small villages and towns in Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado, just like himself. They joined up with the clothes on their backs, some with horses, some without, and only once in a while were they able to get a change of clothing during a skirmish or a raid on Union strongholds. Supplies were like getting Christmas presents, few and far between. They survived by their wits and what they could scrounge from their civilian allies or acquire from their enemies. In a way, they were more guerrillas than regular army. Some of the enlisted cadre were issued uniforms, Ben's sergeant being one of the lucky ones. Ben was a thorn in his side from the moment he enlisted. The regimentation he could handle, it being a necessary part of war, but the sergeant took a fiendish delight in harassing Ben in front of the other men. A showdown was inevitable. The sergeant, like most regulars, was cocky, arrogant, and self-assured. He laughed as Ben told him to draw. He'd teach this rookie a lesson he'd never forget. Fumbling for his pistol, he was no match for Ben Thompson. Ben didn't stay around to find out whether or not the other men were happy over their sergeant's sudden demise. The fact that they didn't pursue him may have a bearing on their attitude, or maybe they just had more respect for Ben's gun than the sergeant had. He deserted then and there, deciding that he'd had enough of army life. There is no record of his being confronted with his desertion or killing his sergeant. And with their cause losing ground rapidly, the Confederate Army had far more serious problems to face. Hitting the trail again, he headed for Austin to freshen up and decide what he was going to do next. Gunfighters like Ben all had one thing in common, a thorough understanding of the capabilities and logistics of their weapons, what they could do and what they could not do with them. Always on the lookout for superior pistols, they had an advantage over most other men: time. Because they didn't work in the usual sense, gunfighters like Ben, when they were on the trail alone with nothing to disturb their thoughts, used the time to their advantage. The knowledge of how far a particular weapon could be fired accurately to the exact foot, or how many grains of black powder were needed for maximum velocity, were among the many survival thoughts that these gunfighters shared, each in his own way. The fast draw was highly important, each man reworking or changing his holster for a smooth, catchless draw. Many a man died because his pistol got snagged or hung up in the holster because he hadn't bothered to cut off 1/4 of an inch of leather in the right place. Little things that spelled death for the man who wasn't fully prepared. Ben made sure that he had all the advantages offered. Ben was always well-dressed and, whenever in town, made frequent trips to the local barber shop. One day, while having his usual shave, a bad man, Jim Coombs, came in to freshen up. Seeing his wanted ad in the local paper, he made the mistake of threatening the barber in order to get rid of the idiot that he was shaving. Ben Thompson. Ben didn't realize until later whom he had killed. By this time, he was beginning to lose count. With hardly a glance at his victim, who had dared to cause the barber to nick his face with a razor, Ben leisurely spruced himself up and took his leave. He headed south for the border, having heard that Emperor Maximilian was looking for American sharpshooters to train and fight with his forces in Mexico. Ben figured that he could be useful to the Emperor inasmuch as he had just served a brief hitch with the Confederate Army. He could have gone on to become one of the great bank robbers of his day, but whether from his religious upbringing or personal morals, there are no recorded instances of him ever having used his gunslinging abilities to gain his fortune illegally. Having no other skills besides printing, and with his love for the outdoors and desire to travel, he just seemed to fall into the life of the gunfighter. His gambling was a very personal and calculated expression of his life. He was not a cheat, as were so many of the men that he played with, and he probably took great satisfaction in ridding the world of a few of these undesirable characters. Arriving in Nuevo Laredo, it didn't take long for Ben Thompson to add a few more notches to his pistol and do a favor for a Mexican who turned out to be just the man that he was looking for. Maximilian, like the Confederate Army, didn't have the funds to supply most of his men with the lavish and colorful uniforms that some of his troops wore. Ben had no way of knowing ahead of time that he saved the life of one of Maximilian's recruiters. Another insight into this gunfighter's psychological makeup, coming to the aid of a stranger when the odds were against him. He was a firm believer in playing his hunches without questioning them. 3-to-1 odds seemed an easy gamble to Ben as he gunned down 2 of the bandidos and took the other one in the throat with his cane. No. Helping the Mexican up, Ben introduced himself and found out who the man was. Over a bottle of tequila, Ben's first priority was reloading his pistol. Unlike the metal cartridges, which were to be invented in a very short time, ammunition comprised of a ball, black powder, a patch, and a percussion cap. These all had to be loaded individually. There were many times unwary men blew their mouths and tongues apart, biting the wrong side of these percussion caps. As you can see, loading a full cylinder, 6 shots, could take a minimum of 2.5 minutes of studied concentration. So much for the Hollywood sharpshooters. After reloading and satisfied with the answers he received, Ben signed up and took off to meet with the recruiter later. He didn't have long to wait at the appointed spot as the Mexican sergeant arrived with 2 of his soldiers. The sergeant had probably filled them in on Ben's lightning draw and how his life had been saved. They all circled Ben and gave this gringo the once-over. The sergeant then introduced him to the others. After sharing a flask of wine, they all took off for the Mexican interior for Ben to start his duties. These men were eagerly looking forward to having a professional gunfighter of Ben Thompson's caliber train them and fight with them. Unfortunately, it was a wasted trip for Ben. The news reached his training camp that Emperor Maximilian had been executed before he hardly had time to make any headway with the local lovely ladies, let alone teach any of the men how to fast draw. His newly acquired friend, the Mexican sergeant, rode with Ben back to the border, paying him off and thanking him for his help, even if it had been short-lived. Ben hit the trail north through Texas and Oklahoma to Kansas, where he was to meet up with his brother Bill. Bill Thompson had sent word to his brother Ben to meet him in Kansas. His escapades in the area had left a trail of dead men behind him. Unlike Ben, Bill reveled in gunplay just for the sake of killing. They met and camped at the outskirts of Ellsworth, Kansas. Catching up on each other's adventures, they decided to team up for a while, and it is said that during their brief sojourn together, they raised quite a bit of hell, and between them shot down at least 25 men. While they were talking over old times, they were not aware of being watched. Hidden in the bushes, one of Sheriff Whitney's sons watched these strangers, trying to determine if they were a threat to his small town. Wireless was not to be invented until 1895, so the only means of communication between towns and villages was by couriers on horseback, who oftentimes carried the mailbags, or by stagecoach. This made small settlements easy prey for men intent on robbery and looting, so it forced everyone to be extremely cautious of strangers in the area. Being a sheriff's son, the young man kept cool and studied Ben and Bill. Anything that he could learn about them while they were off guard would help his father determine what action to take. Getting more suspicious as he watched Ben and Bill, seeing the variety of their weapons and their obvious intention to start into town, the young man was about to leave when Ben began putting on his coat and his now famous top hat. Ben's fame had preceded him to Ellsworth. The youth knew who he was, and he wasn't going to stick around and get caught by these killers. After having checked their equipment, Ben and Bill proceeded into Ellsworth at a leisurely pace, little realizing that their presence had been spotted. The odds of anyone finding their camp were pretty slim. The only reason the boy had found them were the curls of smoke that he had seen in the air and had gone to investigate. With no fire going, Ben and Bill gave no thought to it being discovered. All that Ben and Bill were anticipating were a hot tub, a change of underwear, a shave, and a general freshening up, and maybe a little dallying with the local bar girls. The youngster was hightailing it back into town to tell his father the disturbing news. The outskirts of Ellsworth, where the sheriff's office was located, was not unlike most western towns, infested with weeds in a run-down-looking condition. A center for the outlying ranchers and cowboys to come get their supplies and whoop it up on the weekend. Until the railroads and the wireless really opened up the West, these small communities more or less had to shift for themselves. As soon as Sheriff C.B. Whitney saw his son galloping into town, he knew that something was up. When his excited boy quickly explained who was coming, the sheriff lost no time in setting up his defenses. Not that Ben was the type who initiated violence, but the sheriff was taking no chances with his ruthless brother Bill.
When they rode into town, folks would try to gun them down, but the gunfighters always were prepared. They survived by their speed. Killing first became the creed, but the gunfighters towed his holsters bare. Gunfighters, gunfighters, they're stalking by. Gunfighters, gunfighters, giving the devil one more try.
With both the sheriff and one of his deputies dead at his brother's hand, Ben started getting mad. Shooting the other deputy, he strode out into the middle of the street, screaming at the rest of the ambushers to come out and fight like men. In the meantime, a young man ran into the back of the mayor's office. He was unarmed. The mayor was reluctant, but gave in and supplied the young man with what he asked for. Checking the pistols quickly but carefully, he took a deep breath. Without hesitation, left the mayor's office. While Ben was taunting the rest of the scared townspeople, young Wyatt Earp strode up quickly behind him. Hearing the clicks and the youthful voice behind him, Ben followed one of his strange hunches and let Wyatt Earp disarm him and lead him off to jail. This was one of the rare times that Ben was ever completely taken by surprise. As mad as he was at the ambush, he was calm enough to follow his hunch and thereby save his own life. It's possible that with Ben's speed and lightning reflexes, he might have turned and killed Wyatt, but his own body would have received at least one bullet from Wyatt's guns. Had this happened, Wyatt Earp's name would never have become world-renowned. The big difference between Bill and Ben was clearly evident as Bill fled town. Ben would probably have burst into jail with guns blazing to get his brother out. Ben was given a swift trial, and after hearing the evidence, the circuit judge gave his verdict. Upon hearing the verdict, young Wyatt Earp inwardly fumed. This wasn't the kind of justice he expected after having risked his life. Ben paid his fine, and the judge returned his pistol and belt to him. There was nothing that they could hold Ben for. Someone had come forward and stated that they had seen the deputy fire at Ben before he shot him, so he had to be acquitted. This type of dispensing justice was probably the seed that was planted in Wyatt Earp's young mind and spurred him on to become the great gunfighter he turned out to be, on the right side of the law. As Ben left, however, with his sense of fair play outraged, young Wyatt immediately went up to the judge and turned in his badge, then stomped off, determined to see that men like Ben Thompson will be taken care of, one way or the other. Ben left town and went to the campsite to see if Bill were there. His brother must have left a note for Ben to meet him in Austin later. While Ben was on the trail, Bill was captured and returned to Ellsworth, and ironically was acquitted for the sheriff's killing, because the sheriff had his gun out. Bill later caught up with Ben, who had taken the time to trade horses, and they went into Austin together. Ben's new horse had been losing a shoe, so he had to get to a blacksmith and get it fixed. He was wanted in Austin for the Coombs killing, but he really wasn't worried, for Coombs had been on the wanted list himself. So he was probably a little off guard when an overzealous sheriff snuck up on him and took him into custody. Handing Ben over to his deputy, the sheriff went off to see the judge. Once again, Ben was in the hoosegow, but not for long, for justice was swift in those days. This time, Bill stuck around and went through the trial with him. The fact that it was a bad man that Ben had killed, and with the barber's testimony, Ben's lack of worry over the killing was justified. He was acquitted. Later, he was to come back to this town and get paid for killing more bad men as city marshal. It would seem that justice was determined many times as to whose side you were on, the act of killing being incidental. It probably made men of Ben's ilk extremely cynical of law and order, made them even more aware that their own personal survival was the bottom line. The sheriff, young and eager to further his own career, was not exactly happy to see Ben get off free. He quickly let Ben and Bill know that they were not wanted in Austin and to get out of town fast. Bill must have been in a good humor, otherwise there could very easily have been another dead sheriff added to his list. So without any time to barely shake off the dust from Ellsworth, they headed for the prairies again. Maybe Ben had had enough of Bill's killing out of hand, or maybe he just wanted his privacy. In any event, they split up to go their own separate ways, never to see each other again. Bill riding off into oblivion, for there is no more record of him. Ben headed for Kansas City, but decided to try his luck in Abilene, where he struck up a friendship with a man named Phil Coe. They went into partnership and opened the Bull's Head Saloon. With Ben's love and knowledge of gambling, plus his need for a rest from prolonged traveling, Phil Coe and he made their saloon a success. But this time, Wild Bill Hickok was the marshal of Abilene. Ben and Phil Coe were putting up a sign one day when Hickok happened to be passing by. Hickok took offense at it, thinking it was too pornographic. He told them he wanted the sign removed, then and there. Phil Coe was ready to go after Hickok, but Ben stopped him. Hickok told them that he ran the town his way, to accept it or get out. Ben had a healthy respect for Hickok and decided to back off and calmed his partner down. Hickok got the last word without any bloodshed. They took the sign down. Next morning, Ben took off to see one of his rancher friends and to clear his head over the near confrontation with Wild Bill. In those days, the top gunfighters had a mutual understanding that they would leave each other alone and not precipitate a showdown. This understanding, though never spoken or talked about, was probably based on a healthy respect for each other's abilities with regard to gunplay. Wild Bill had a temper and was not used to knuckling under, so to put one's life on the line over a pornographic sign and risk sudden death from Hickok's blazing guns was not what Ben would have considered a good gamble. Had the roles been reversed, it was doubtful that Wild Bill would have backed off, and one of them would have died. Then again, if it had been some bushwhacker who had given them trouble over the sign, Ben would have had no compunction about killing him. Later, Ben had business in Kansas City and took off, leaving Phil Coe to manage the saloon. He was getting restless. Not long after Ben left Abilene, Wild Bill, making his daily rounds, found that Coe had put up the sign again. Pornography in those days meant revealing a woman's ankle, let alone her whole leg. Hickok, for all his womanizing, took his job seriously and knew that he had a problem with Coe. Taking his jacket off and telling his deputy to stand by, Hickok yelled for Coe to come out. Facing each other, Hickok warned Coe once again about the sign. Phil, angry, went for his gun too late. Hickok shot him. Hearing a click behind him, he spun and fired. Hickok peered down to see who he had killed. Stepping over the body, he saw that it was his own deputy. At this time, it is on record that Wild Bill had glaucoma, with his vision getting steadily worse. It was shortly after this episode that he turned his badge in and joined up with the circus. How two top gunfighters like Ben Thompson and Wild Bill Hickok, living in the same town, never faced one another in a duel is extraordinary, to say the least. After he arrived in Kansas City, Ben heard of Phil Coe's death, and it is recorded that he said he would have to confront Hickok someday and cut him down. Their paths, however, never crossed again. Ben heard about a fight that was going on in Colorado over a pass that the Santa Fe, Denver, and Rio Grande railroads were having right-of-way troubles with. He drifted through Kansas and across Colorado to Durango to find out about it. Ben Thompson was a traveler at heart. The sheer beauty of the Rockies must have made him feel right at home. The very fact that Ben was always on the go somewhere, traveling long distances, showed him to be a man who seemed to be at peace with himself, regardless of all the killings attributed to him. His psychological makeup must have prevented him from feeling any remorse for the lives he took. In frontier times, when life hung on a shoestring, a man couldn't afford the luxury of giving way to emotions if he wanted to survive. Ben was a survivor. One of his mottos could very easily have been, "Pleasure is for the living, not the dead." And made one of the best deals in his life. $20,000 for ensuring that the railroad would have no further problems with the pass. The manager must have heard of Ben's prowess. $20,000 in those days would be in the neighborhood of $250,000 today. But with millions at stake and a continent to conquer, this was a small amount compared to the profits a railroad could make. In those days, $1 a day with food and lodgings were considered good wages in the West, and a man had to work hard to get the money. $20,000 was an impossible fortune for most men to consider, except in their dreams. After having given Ben half the money for the job that he was to do, the manager offered Ben a drink before he took off to settle things at the pass. Ben must have been back in short order to collect the rest of his pay, so he settled the dispute without any gunplay, which showed that Ben had all the qualities necessary to have become a successful businessman if he had chosen. But history tells us otherwise. With a fortune in his pocket, Ben hit the trail again, probably going through New Mexico and back into Texas. He traded horses once again, which was not uncommon, for with the tremendous amount of traveling that he did through rugged country, having a horse go lame was just another hazard to be reckoned with. His addiction to gambling, coupled with his easy-come, easy-go attitude toward life, must have drawn him to any saloon that chanced to cross his path. It isn't known what he did with his money, but in all probability he gambled most of it away in a short time. Hearing that Austin, Texas was having more than its fair share of gun-happy troublemakers and was in need of someone to really clean it up, Ben headed back there. We take it for granted that a trip of 1,000 miles or so can be accomplished in a couple of days by automobile or in a few hours by plane. In those days, at the average rate of 20 miles per day, without stopovers, it would take almost 50 days, or approximately 7 weeks, to make the trip. After having been interviewed by the Austin Town Council and approved, Ben went over to the judge's office to be sworn in. Ben's job as city marshal for Austin, Texas, gave him the power of life and death over any man who chose to confront him. Austin, like so many western towns, was fair game for armed drifters and gunslingers wanted by the law. Few of them stayed in any location for any length of time, keeping on the move, trying to keep ahead of their wanted posters. Many of them succeeded for a while, communication between towns being as slow as it was. This was Ben's first official job of working on the right side of the law, and he went at it with a vengeance. He cleaned up the town in short order, giving the local undertaker plenty of business along with the official photographer. As soon as a wanted man was killed, his body was taken to the jailhouse and propped up against the wall. Powder flashed to give a permanent record in daguerreotype, many of which are still fully preserved today. Apart from being proof that a man was dead, and allowing the reward money to be collected, beginning of the highly sophisticated form of criminal investigation that we have today. As city marshal, Ben could be seen once in a while in church. Whether this was playing politics or to help salve his conscience will never be known. But he was well respected for keeping Austin a safe place to live in. The judge, typical of the hanging judges of his day, started getting mad because Ben was bypassing his authority and leaving him no live men to pronounce sentence on. He started looking around for an excuse to get rid of Ben. And got it the day Ben accidentally wounded a local carpenter when he pointed a hammer at him. The judge happened to be a witness to the shooting and didn't lose any time ordering Ben to come to his office. Ben's reflexive wounding of a local bystander must have piqued his sense of honor and Gunfighter's code. If the man had died, Ben could have been hung for it. Human psychology being what it is, the local townsfolk completely forgot that Ben had rid their community of bad men and made it a safe place once again. The judge had the full backing of the township when he tongue-lashed Ben and fired him. Now he could safely get back to a hanging or two. Without so much as a handshake, Ben took leave of Austin and hit the trail again, this time heading for San Antonio. He must have felt much the same way General MacArthur did after having cleaned up the Pacific and being recalled. People don't like being reminded that someone else has done their dirty work for them. As City Marshal of Austin, Ben probably held back on his gambling, but free once again, he hit the saloons to pursue his favorite pastime. Jack Harris owned and operated one of the saloons, and Ben got into a game with him. Not much got past Ben's eagle eyes unnoticed, and the bar girl sitting on his lap was obviously signaling his boss. Ben let it ride for a while, Harris obviously not knowing who he was playing with. Smug and sure of himself, having suckered countless other gamblers in the past, Harris must have thought this dandy with the top hat was just another easy mark. Harris's lady friend, Lil, who was always on hand to break the concentration of her man's gambling opponents with her feminine wiles, was another valuable asset to Harris's setup. Ben was losing, and when Harris raised the pot $100, Ben decided to call Harris's bluff by calling his bet with his own hat. As Harris grabbed for the money, Ben stopped him, accusing him of cheating. Reaching for his derringer, Harris never knew what hit him as Ben blasted him through the table. Lil, the bar girl, and the rest of Harris's staff suddenly saw their means of livelihood yanked from under them. Ben knew he had shaken up a hornet's nest, but probably felt justified in ridding the town of a parasite. The bartender wisely didn't point his shotgun at Ben, who backed out cautiously, keeping them all covered. If she had had a gun, Lil would probably have tried to kill Ben then and there and would most likely have joined her man on the floor. Looking up at Ben, Lil swore she'd get him someday. Shanghai Pierce was hosting a cattlemen's convention in one of the local hotels in Austin. He let it be known that T.J. Edwards wasn't welcome at the party. Pierce was one of the cattle barons of his day, holding a tight rein over thousands of people's lives in his area. His word was law, and people had better cater to him or else. The local Texas Ranger was giving a speech, telling a few jokes, but hardly anyone was paying any attention to it. Shanghai was feeling his liquor and trying to get someone to get him some food. He wasn't having much luck either. The other cattlemen were there to enjoy themselves to his drunken needs. These men weren't his cowhands and foremen, subject to his whims and orders. If they had business with him, they could wait until he sobered up. As the banquet hostess passed by, one of the men gave her a playful pat. She turned and told him that was going to cost him. The rancher told her to put it on the bill. Shanghai finally decided to head for the food, the shortest way. No sooner was he on the table when the doors burst open and Ben confronted them. Who says my friend T.J. Edwards ain't good enough to come to this shindig? Even in his half-crocked state, Shanghai Pierce realized it wasn't healthy to stick around. The others left warily by more conventional routes, leaving a scared stranger to face Ben's wrath, as the hostess came in to see what the rumpus was all about. Looking around, she demanded to know who was going to take care of the bill and all the damages. Ben made his apologies and promised he'd see that Pierce would take care of everything. She told him to make sure that he did, or she'd come after Ben herself. Ben slowly advanced on the ranger, who wished he was someplace else. "You got anything against Edwards, Ranger?" Scared, the ranger shook his head and told Ben that he didn't want any trouble. Ben had no quarrel with the ranger and left. The poor man must have felt like a rabbit cowering in his warren as a rattler confronted him. Ben was like a snake in many ways, but he also had a human side, and this poor scared ranger was no threat to him, one of the lucky ones Ben allowed to live. At this time, another gunfighter, King Fisher, whose reputation was on par with Ben's, drifted into Austin. He and Ben met and hit it off well together, each one respecting the other's prowess. Fisher had to pick up a prisoner in San Antonio, and as Ben was heading back that way, they teamed up for a while, hitting the saloons, having their fun with the girls, and enjoying themselves in general. They must have made quite a pair, Ben with his top hat and cane, and King with his dandy clothes and bell spurs that announced his presence wherever he walked, with their tingling ring. Free with their money, they undoubtedly had no problems obtaining their women, and paid them generously. The bar girls and ladies of the night in those days led a precarious life, never knowing from one night to the next whether the men that they were entertaining would treat them right. Because of their lack of social standing in the towns, these girls were at the mercy of their clients, and had almost no recourse if things went bad for them. Women who sold their favors to men like Ben and King most probably felt a sense of security that they didn't have with their regular customers. After all, who would dare interfere with a gunfighter when he was with his woman? Make no mistake, they were constantly on guard. Even going from one room to another, these men made sure that they were armed. When bedded down, they always had their pistols within easy reach. Ben and King hit the trail for San Antonio. King had settled down to a job as deputy in Uvalde County and took his work seriously. Up to this time, he had 20 killings credited to him. No longer wanted by the law, his life was easygoing, except when dealing with outlaws and bad men. Then he became the same well-oiled machine that Ben was, calm, confident, and deadly. Reaching San Antonio after they took care of their horses and cleaned up, they headed for the old Jack Harris Theater Bar, where Ben had disposed of the prior owner, and whose body was barely cold in its grave. Coming out of the bar, a customer spotted them on the sidewalk and rushed back in to alert Lil, Jack Harris's woman, who now ran the saloon. She immediately prepared herself and her staff to welcome Ben Thompson and King Fisher. Whether it was because they were together and enjoying themselves and not 100% alert, or just plain ego because they were two of the deadliest gunfighters alive and felt that together they were invulnerable, they walked into the saloon without a care in the world, sauntered up to the bar and ordered a couple of drinks. They were the last drinks Ben and King ever ordered. A fusillade of bullets and shotgun slugs smashed their bodies from all directions, slamming them back and forth as they slumped to the floor. It's ironic that King Fisher was really an innocent bystander who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. After killing 40 men, Ben's life ended at the hands of a wrathful woman who had sworn she would get him for what he had done to her lover. Ben Thompson died at the age of 41 in 1884. His funeral stretched for blocks, his silk top hat shining in the sun on the top of his coffin. Ben Thompson, one of the great gunfighters of the West.
They would take every chance when they did their deadly dance. They were fearless and bold without a doubt. Never once was a thought that they'd finally be caught, but their luck started quickly running out. They never knew what hit them when an ambush was at hand, and they never saw their lifeblood dripping slowly on the sand.